Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply. In this video is to bring you a closer look at the Bommer. This is their part number LB4391C in a 350R in a 630. This is in essence, this is a spring hinge, but this is in essence a reverse spring hinge, and that's what the R means in the part number. A reverse spring hinge literally does the opposite job of a standard spring hinge, meaning you have a regular single acting door, let's say a condo unit in a 100-unit building. Those doors are fire rated. They may only be 20 minute, they may be 45 minute. 45 minute most likely, a 1 hour fire separation corridor. They could be 60 minute as well, depending on the code. And if they're on a path of egress, they could be 60 minute. Nonetheless, they have to be self-closing. Well, in that application, when you open that door, it needs to self-close. And people, especially in residential applications, will very often use spring hinges rather than hydraulic door closers. Hydraulic door closers certainly aren't considered very residential, even though they're more elegant than spring hinges to solve a job. So your regular hinge is going to help close that door. Well, a reverse hinge is going to work in the opposite sort of scenario, meaning if you had it installed in that same sort of single acting door, it will want to push the door open. Okay, obviously not for fire rated types of applications. And obviously a fire rated door has to be, the cardinal rules are self-closing, self-latching. Free swinging is another rule of fire rated doors. This would not, of course, permit a self-closing door in the traditional sense, that's for sure. So where will you use this? You will literally have instances on a manager's office door where they want the door propped open at 90 degrees at all times unless there's something happening. And then the door's open and it opens back up. Sometimes a restroom door is like that as well. You know, a teacher's lounge, wherever you may want the door to stand proud of its opening, and then only have it closed for specific instances, and then on its own accord open back up. Another time that we see that we use these hinges is when people will use them in a full surface application. Now, this is not the right hinge to use for a full surface application because this is a full mortise hinge, and that's certainly inferred in the part number. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaves here that it's not meant to be surface mounted, even though you can. I have a client who builds gates in a, it might be a marina sort of application on a lake, or maybe it might be on the Atlantic coast up northeast. And they have these half gates, and they are surface mounting these hinges. Well, they're using regular spring hinges to make those gates close again, and you can kind of get away with that for a bit, but they'll fail eventually because you're using the standard spring hinge in the opposite way in which it's meant to work. The fact that you're surface mounting it doesn't give you the right sort of opportunity to make that hinge go like this and then snap back, you know, to this position. Okay, so this client that uses that material for that sort of installation, what this client does with these half doors is they had historically used the regular hinge, and they did have failure over time because the spring is not meant to be coiled in that sort of situation, and they do fail. And interestingly enough, when I had initially described the condition to the manufacturer, without even seeing the photographs, the tech support, a long-time hardware guy, been in the industry for decades at Bommer, knew exactly what the problem was, knew exactly what it was. This fella's forgotten more about spring hinges than people have ever learned. So in this client's half-door scenario, surface mounting them wasn't a problem because they had a huge gap between the jamb post and their door, and that barrel, that substantial thickness of the barrel, could sit right in that gap. And then all we did was sold the client reverse spring hinges, okay, so that when the gate was opened, what is it going to want to do? come back flat. When the gate is open, come back flat. Open, come back flat. Problem solved. So the error that the client made was thinking that they would work and then said, hey, what's the warranty on these hinges? They're failing. Tell me more. Bommer spring hinges don't break. They very rarely, not that they don't ever, but it's quite rare. And in fact, the same gentleman at the factory is in charge of testing so that they can attest to the grade 1 nature of the hinge, which means it passes 1 million cycles. And I don't recall if the gentleman told me the number. Oh, actually, he did. He stated that they tested these, and after 3.5 million cycles, they just stopped testing because it didn't break. So something of that nature is what it was. And so once the client got the right surface mount hinge, he was back in business. So let's dissect the rest of the part number now that we've talked about the reverse action. And that's what the R means in the part number. LB in the part number means lube bearing. It is a maintenance-free bearing type construction from Bommer that they use on their spring hinges. The only thing, back to the fire rating, the only thing that's odd is this leaf is still stamped, that it's UL listed. This is listed for use on a fire door. The way that they've constructed the spring obviously will run afoul of that. So this is, it's listed. It bears the list, the indication that it's listed, but you wouldn't find a happy conclusion to the operation of the door. So be mindful, you would not be using this on a fire rated door. In any application that I can think of. Okay, now moving forward. The LB is a maintenance-free lube bearing construction, LB lube bearing, that will give this the ability to be grade 1, several million cycles in fact. The 4391 is a reference to the shape of this hinge. There is a link below this video to the template, and when I mean shape, I mean the the square nature of the hinge, the 1/4-inch radius corners, the location of the screw holes, and this is template. This would be considered standard for a 3.5-inch hinge when it is the template pattern. It's also a commercial grade hinge where the thickness of that leaf is going to be 123 thousandths. Or 130. I forget what a 3.5 is. I think it's 130. Actually, I'm looking at the template. It does indeed state 130 thousandths. Let's put the caliper on and see what it comes out to. 1.36, pardon me, 1.38. 1.38. That just means that the leaf at the end is a little flared out because of how it's put through a press brake. But technically, this is a hinge that's 130 thousandths thick. And that's important to know, so that if you're putting this onto something, you know exactly what hinge leaf thickness you're dealing with. The template will give you all of the location for the screw holes. If you're replacing something, absolutely check those, because you could have something that are not these same locations. It's unlikely, but it is possible, especially when you get into 4-inch hinges and 4.5 that have 4 holes for screws on them. Okay, so double check that. You don't want to get this hinge to find out that the holes are in the wrong location, and then you're doweling, redrilling, things of that nature. The 4391 also conspires to tell us with the C in the part number tells us it's the thicker leaf hinge, the 130 thousandths, versus the residential hinge that is about 97 thousandths, so that'd be thinner. The 4391 is also a stainless hinge. This hinge is made of stainless steel. What's interesting, though, is it does appear to me that they put a lacquer over this, which I'm thinking is just an error that they would do that. I wouldn't want lacquer on solid stainless because lacquer is just going to be something that will flake off. But the sheen that's on the hinge, as I look at it, reflecting the light, tells me there's a lacquer on it. This is 630. That means two things. It's made of stainless, and it's also in a satin finish. Okay, the spring that's inside of here is not your regular spring for a spring hinge. This is a spring that is made of steel indeed, but that it does have a coating to give it the ability to be or to operate as a non-ferrous type of item. It has a all but impervious coating on the spring that gives it the ability to be compatible with a non-ferrous hinge like this. The 350 in the part number, that means that it's a 3.5 hinge. The height is the first dimension on hinges like this. 3.5 tall, the height is the first dimension. The width is the second dimension, 3.5, 350. That is the opposite way in which doors are sized. So be mindful that if you're dealing with a hinge and it's square, you can get by without knowing that the height is the first dimension. But when you get into rectangular hinges, like a spring hinge that could be 4.5 by 4, or a wide throw hinge that could be 3.5 by 6, you need to know that the height is the first dimension. You wouldn't want to manufacture doors that are being called out as 4.5 by 5 or 5 by 4.5, thinking that the height was the second dimension. That would give you the wrong prep on the door and frame. The point of the matter is height's the first dimension on hinges. Okay, the R in the part number, well, again, that means reverse action. Okay, there is lots of details down below. This is a full mortise hinge. Again, you can see from the swag on the hinge leaf, the leaves are meant to be mortised flush to the door and frame when the leaves are brought parallel to give you that normal sort of margin between the two doors. It's a C version, contract grade. It is UL listed for fire applications, but this hinge, unless you have some sort of odd situation, it will not close your door, assuming you have a standard door. I can't think of an application where you need a reverse hinge to get your door to the open position. It's grade 1, million cycles. It's non-handed. You can install these this way or this way. Doesn't matter. We'll talk about the tension in a moment. Self-lubricated bearings, maintenance-free bearing construction, easily adjustable spring tension, ANSI templated screw hole pattern. We talked about that. The pivot point aligns with other commercial butt hinges that are 123 to 134 thousandths thick. That means you can mix and match this with a non-spring hinge, provided that the leaf thickness is within that range, 123 to 134, and it's, of course, 3.5 inch wide. Okay, it's going to have to be at least the same width. Like, it can be taller, which it wouldn't be, but it could be. You could buy 4 by 3.5 inch hinges, which I've never really seen that. But as long as the vertical axis of pivoting is compatible, you won't have a problem. Made of stainless with a 1/4 inch radius. How that's achieved is when you are routing the door and frame with your router, your 1/2 inch diameter bit, that's going to leave a 1/4 inch radius unless you go back and square the corners. And it's very typical and common that people don't. And that what they're seeing is a radiused corner, and that's what they believe that they need to have. Even though some instances you can't get a radiused corner, or you're relegated because of what you want for the hinge, that it is only square corner. So sometimes you have to square those corners out with your hammer and chisel. 6 holes on the hinge, and speaking of the holes again, screws are included. Those are going to be in a stainless finish, stainless base material as well. Okay. Stainless is very marginally magnetic when it's worked. This is going to be a type 304 stainless alloy. Quantity of spring hinges, and this really applies to regular standard traditional spring hinges, but if you've got a 70-pound door up to 3070 in size, 3 foot by 7 foot, 2 spring hinges and a regular hinge. And when you install 3 hinges and only 2 of them are spring, middle and bottom for the spring hinges. Top is not where you want to put that. You want a ball bearing hinge up there. 70% of the weight of the door is hung on that top hinge, in fact, and a spring hinge is technically not load rated, so don't put the spring hinge there first. If you're going to do something that's 90 pounds in that range, 3 spring hinges is what you'll want. There is a link below that to the replacement tension pin and the tension rod, which we'll get into in a moment. People will very often call and need only the tension pins because they've been lost, and the spring hinges no longer work because the painter took them out, threw them away, painted the doors, tension pins got lost. There is a note on the operation of a reverse action spring hinge, which we've gone over thoroughly. Let's move to the installation instructions. I'll link below this video. Those are going to talk about really how you set the tension. And with every order that you place for spring hinges, you'll get at least one tension rod, and for every hinge that you order of this type, you'll get one tension pin. This client happens to have 2 hinges on his order, so he gets 2 tension pins. He needs one for each hinge. When you are going to set the tension, hang your door. There's no tension when it comes out of the box. Hang the door with the tension collar pointed towards the top of the door. That's this area here. You'll notice there's not one down here. You can do it this way as well. Just reverse the following instructions. Insert the tension rod, and I've poked it out of the end of the bag here, into one of the holes and turn it clockwise. And as you do that, you reveal new additional holes. Into one of those new additional holes, you'll insert a tension pin. That's how you retain tension. Do not exceed 3 holes if you're going to 180 degree. Do not exceed 4 holes when you get to 90 degree. If you hear severe creaking, that's the spring contorting, back off. If you've already hit the quantity of holes and you still need more, you need to add another spring hinge. Or you need to abandon the spring hinge concept and go with hydraulic control altogether, like a surface-mounted closer, concealed closer, overhead or floor closer, whatever it might be. But that's how you set the tension on these. Super simple. I like to do the tension in the middle hinge first, that bottom hinge, and then lastly the top hinge if there's one there. Certifications and hinge selection guide, that will give you at the bottom how many spring hinges to use based on weight and size. So be mindful of that. Always use a ball bearing hinge with spring hinges if you are mixing and matching. NFPA 80 technically requires the NFPA, the standard. It's a standard. NFPA 80 is a standard that outlines fire safety, and that you have to have a minimum of 2 spring hinges on a labeled application, and that those hinges must bear tangible evidence of the fact that they're listed. That word with UL above it means that this is compliant. That is a listed device used, that has been tested, that has a piece of paper on file at the testing laboratory that says, yep, on such and such date, we slapped this hinge on this door installation, and sure enough, it passed the test. So it must have that stuff. If you're dealing with an ADA compliant opening, spring hinges can be used in ADA compliant. There is a minimum time requirement for doors to get to the closed position. I'd have to look up the ADA guidelines. I think it might be 2 seconds, believe it or not, to get from full open to about 20 degree closed or something like that. But there are ADA outlines for spring hinges that they can be used. You'd need to consult ADA, the ADA guidelines, the A117 guideline for that particular information. Spring hinges and handicap doors, you know, really, you know, you've got someone on a wheelchair, and that spring hinge is just going to hit the wheelchair right away, damage the door, damage the wheelchair. The user's not going to have a safe environment through which to pass. So if it's an ADA compliant opening, I would steer clear of spring hinges. But that's not how it always is. Non-labeled doors, you can get up to a maximum of 4 foot. And then for every 7'6" in height, 90 inch, use an additional hinge for every 30 inches thereafter. Now, setting the tension. I like having more spring hinges rather than less on a door, and it's not because I'm a spring hinge salesman, as much as I find that you have better success. If you have a standard door and the weight's not an issue, I opt to put all 3 on there because I can better control that door. Installations that I'm referring to would be exterior common doors to a 3-flat building. Those doors always have spring hinges on them. Not always, but generally do. That door needs to close. It needs to latch. There's an intercom system there with an electric strike, and you don't want that door open for anyone to walk into the heated area on the inside of that opening. I find when I have more spring hinges rather than less, I have better ability to control that door to get it not only closed, to move all of the air pressure out of the door's way as it's closing, but to get it to overcome the resistance of the lip of the strike and then to latch itself and do so reliably, predictably, dependably. Sometimes you have to set the tension so high that the door slams and bounces open. Well, a slamming door is going to cause damage over time and is not going to work reliably for very long. When you have more spring hinges, I liken it to a tugboat. You have more ability to pull. You're not going to go very fast, but you have a lot of torque, so to speak. More residual stored energy in the spring as the door approaches its last 20 degree is better. More torque. You don't have to set the tension up so high so that you're forcing the door through inertia to get moving through the closing process. You can kind of move it with enough energy at the end to at least as elegantly as possible close and latch. And that's where I come in, and then also with more spring hinges, I've adjusted these things in all seasons. With more spring hinges, you also have the ability to adjust with the changing of the seasons, meaning in the summertime, windows are going to be open. The air pressure is different than it is in the wintertime, and you have different requirements on spring hinges as the cycle of the seasons goes through. All right, finally, there is a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the Bommer products that we sell, but also a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. And the last thing I'd like to point out to you is the Bommer logo. And right above it, it says Made in USA, a fact that Bommer is quite proud of, as am I to represent them. Any questions on the Bommer LB4391C and a 350R and a 630? And being stainless, you can certainly order this in 629, a polished stainless. And of course, you can order this as a ferrous-based material, steel. Then you can do onto that all the finishes. You want prime coat, bright black Japan, zinc coated, your brasses, your bronze, your chromes, your satins, your polished, your nickels, anything. Bommer can plate practically any finish on a steel-based hinge. So be mindful that they can accommodate this. And then there's probably 10 other designs of spring hinges with different shapes, different corner treatments, and different locations of holes for the screws. Any questions on this or any other Bommer product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.